Jimmy, I'm so happy that we have the opportunity to speak here in your studio in Montmartre in Paris. And knowing also that Paris, of course, is a very important place for you. You grew up here, you spent your formative years in the city, but then you also left at an early age for your education, and you've lived in the UK and in Belgium. And I think at the end of 2023, you moved back with your partner.
Yeah.
You were in between
Summer
Germany.
23. Yeah.
Summer 2023. Summer 2023, you moved back to Paris with your partner, and now you're splitting your time. What is that like to be back in the city that really shaped you, but you also left for a lot of reasons we will talk about?
Yeah. It's great. It's a fantastic opportunity to have the chance to return somewhere, but it's also a great kind of challenge to think of it as something else than a return. And because I'm not the same person, I left at 19 and I was this really angry, almost like teenager, and I was just like, oh, what's going on here? I can't take it. I need to be somewhere else. I need to see something else. I need to have access to different things.
Yeah.
And I had my first boyfriend in London then, and it was a very kind of easy move. He was into music, and there were dancers around, and representation was also at a different stage in London then. I don't
And
want to
we're
sound
talking
nostalgic,
which
but
period now, approximately?
90s. We're talking
96,
96.
Yeah.
95, 96, and I think in terms of culturally in London there was a lot of things going on in terms of fashion and politics. I went to Goldsmiths, so Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Françoise Vergès were there, so it was a very different vibe, let's say, and discourse. It was kind of saying, okay, they're trying to set equal opportunities, and you had questionnaires, in every institution that kind of surveyed like how many people were then represented from different ethnicities, gender, questions of equalities and diversity, which we are actually dealing with now everywhere. They were already happening then in the UK, which was interesting. And back then in France, people were saying, oh, okay, this is a form of tokenism. But I was like, what are you doing, though? So I didn't feel that this was happening in France. And so that's also partly why I left. I didn't feel like I could go to art school. They were gearing us maybe more towards marketing and, getting a job, which is also fair, but not necessarily thinking in terms of creativity, thinking of like what else, could be done, how we could participate in culture.
Yeah.
There was hardly any representation of Black bodies, within, except, stereotypes. And
especially in the art world and
Yes.
educational settings.
Yes, exactly. And when I moved to London and I studied at Goldsmiths, I had a teacher that was, a teacher of color and was making films. And so it was a really interesting shift, to be able to see representation, people in advertising in a way that I was not seeing it in France then.
And in Paris also not.
Yeah, but it was then cliched, like a Black person representing chocolate, and it was just like, okay. So, advertising, a lot of things, Jean-Paul Goude, for Lafayette, they were like these very iconic figures, working with Black bodies, Grace Jones and all of this, but always kind of playing with the stereotype, but also nourishing it weirdly. And so it was like interesting then to be in London and have like, this diversity of culture and be batting into it and questioning it, and also be looking at France from a distance, because suddenly I was French there, and then people were like, oh, but you are French, so what is that? And so I started looking at literature and the language also a bit more. So, and because
but you were talking about this anger, as a 19-year-old. What was that like? Like, what did you feel? And did that come from, this atmosphere you were just describing, the lack of representation, the lack of discourse, the lack of just verbalizing or talking about it.
Yeah, and visibility also. So representation and inability to kind of say, okay, what is different? How do we talk about it? Because it's a universal. There's this sense of universalism here, where like we're all equal, égalité, fraternité, and then it's like, well, what are the facts of this? And then and it's there is elitism also, and so access is not for all necessarily. So there was this big difference between the suburbs and the center of Paris at the time, and I think still there is. And so in some clubs there were discriminations. I would go to a club and then I would be refused entry because of my shoes. So and then I would come with a friend from London and they would say, oh yes, you can come in, but you can't. And my friend would be like, yeah, well then I'm not coming either. So that was going on, and I think some people actively fought against that. As I was leaving the country, there was like Harlem Désir, touche pas mon pote. There were all of these kind of NGOs working against racism and discrimination. But then I felt, I don't know, I just maybe there was the strategy, the running away strategy, and trying to see something else, experience something
to break
else.
out, which is also normal at this age for sure. But did you already have back then at least the idea in mind that you could be an artist or become an artist, take that route? Or how did this develop, particularly also with your move to London?
Yeah, I think for sure the move to London increased the possibility of it, and that's why it was interesting. And I guess maybe allowing myself also to do something different, being somewhere different, living a sexuality also differently. So I guess all of that was part of a whole package of kind of allowing a space to exist that was maybe not existing there, and being a foreigner somewhere else, and then constructing a new self. And then I think it was that maybe just about allowing things to be, in a way that it was much more difficult. So coming back now, I'm like this person who has gone through many different experiences. But then at some point, I felt a little bit like teenager again, and I was just like, "Oh my God, no!" Like
now you've been feeling this again in a way. This is the sense of
because I'm kind of 30 years on. It's like, where am I now in relation to all of these things that I was thinking? Where is Paris now, and what are the discourses here now, and have things changed? Have things changed, and it's interesting also to see that the extreme right is still kind of threatening to take power after so many years. We're still in this battle with the extreme right. So in a way, some things haven't really changed. I was thinking, like where power is and where power lies, this hasn't really changed.
But how has your maybe response to it changed? Or do you feel you can interact or maybe also react differently to this like social atmosphere and cultural atmosphere?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there are definitely voices and people working differently and wanting to hear these voices. Well, before I felt pretty much voiceless. So I think there is definitely a change in terms of some institutions, curators, artists that are now represented and are talking and are active in changing things. But the question then to myself then is how to kind of use these opportunities to then see where I'm positioning myself now, and then what I can say, what I want to say, and how relevant that is. But I was thinking how also interestingly a lot of thinkers, writers had moved away, like Maryse Condé was like in the US, they were talking about colonialism, but from away from France, not in France. They were teaching in the US, they were teaching in the UK.
The same with Françoise Vergès. She was also gone for a long time.
Yeah. So then it was interesting that, now these people are back, so it's interesting also, okay, why they also returned, what made them feel that they could return and have these conversations.
Yeah.
So now I'm excited to meet new people, to kind of engage for this little time that I'm here, because I'm here until for another year and a half with my partner, and the reason why I'm here is also because of his job. And so I'm in between Paris and Berlin, still teaching in Berlin, going there a week per month, and so I'm in between the two cities, and I think that's also a good compromise, or that's a good feeling to be in between the two cities, because they're very different perspectives, different things going on, and so it feels good.
Yeah. Let's go back to your time in London, because you said earlier that it was, and that's also probably really the nature of the age you were at that point. It was very much about constructing or reconstructing a new identity in a way. And how would you relate this to the emergence of your practice, too, of your artistic practice in those years? How did that start? I mean, you already talked about the interest in language, and I think you even started in France studying literature, and then you knew that it wasn't really the right thing. And it would be interesting for me to learn more about this path, you know, how you, from language maybe, you know, started evolving as an artist who works, and we'll talk about this later, in many different formats and disciplines.
Well, I think what kind of biographically happened is like I was doing this baccalaureate at the time that was to do with literature, languages, and philosophy.
Kind of the A levels and.
Yes, exactly. And then, but like majoring in this kind of, you know, literary interest, let's say. And then I started English literature, and that was very academic and not very enticing at Sorbonne. And I was like, oh my God, no. And then, this move to London was really fast, and it was a bit also like, I didn't really necessarily didn't know what I would do. And so then I did this foundation class, and there you kind of geared towards, you know, design or fashion or, you know, fine art. And I was already working with photography, text, the relation language, image. And as I said earlier, being away from France, I started looking at French as a language from a distance and trying to play with it. And also, I was very much interested in the idea of translation and reading Blanchot, who's writing about literature, and writing the essays that I was writing then at school were all literary based, or based on literature rather. And so it was about kind of trying to understand the role of writing and how like language is a construct, and how like we can also challenge this. And so it was on one hand thinking of representation through images, but also through language and how they interact and interconnect, and can like create new challenges, and mostly in terms of like what we think representation does or can do. And same with performance and the body live, and questioning a bit like the presence or the positioning of the body, and whether it's political, whether it's poetic, you know. And so it's just like, I don't know, there was an opportunity. It felt like being away was still an opportunity to look at those things in a way that would not have been possible staying in France.
And how did, because you were earlier mentioning, and that's true particularly, I guess already starting in the 80s too, this whole movement of cultural studies in the UK, people like Stuart Hall. I'm also thinking about the Black body or Black queer body, about artists like Isaac Julian, of course, who centralized these questions in their work. How did this atmosphere influence you or help you?
It was great. It was great. There was also Steve McQueen, was the YBAs, because when I arrived, it was the explosion of the YBAs, and Steve McQueen was making this incredible, still is making these incredible films, where the Black body was present, and there was a whole array of like artists, you know, that are again being represented or made visible right now. That were working with photography conceptually, and that were nourishing, you know, my practice. And at the same time, weirdly, it was interesting because there was this sense also of like not wanting to work in this field of identity, because not be reduced to it, and not be like, I'm mostly at art school, I'm this Black artist, so I should be talking about Blackness, and be kind of pigeonholed in that sense. So I was like, okay, I'm working, but I'm making art, and then we'll see what happens. But so there was this kind of like resistance a little bit towards that. And I feel, I mean, that's something maybe that might develop along, you know, as we kind of continue speaking, of like, when do you do that, and how do you do it from your own perspective, and not because like the outside is kind of telling you to do it, and you should be. Because there is a funny anecdote. I was in somewhere once, and I presented my work, and somebody said, "Oh, but it's very European." And I
But that
like,
was
"What?"
within Europe, or
Yes, that was within Europe.
Yeah.
And I was just like, what did you expect? So, so there's this
Yes.
thing also, and funnily also, I had this from a curator coming from outside of Europe, from West Africa, saying, "Oh, your work could have been made by a woman." And I was like, "Is that a bad thing?" So there was also like, we were talking
Projections
different
of
times, at least 20 years ago, so having different conversations were occurring. But, nonetheless, and each time thinking, oh, well, then I'm not making work that looks like, this or that. So how then to kind of position it and how to find a language around it? Do I then need to create the language around my work rather than wait for others to create
impose
it for me?
or project
Impose it or
onto you.
project it, yeah.
But I also wanted to ask, because I think this is also in terms of blackness very interesting, because you enter now this field in Britain that is already kind of very much nurtured by theorists, academics, but it's in a way also a black British environment now, and you are coming as a French person, raised in Paris, born in Guadeloupe. How did you experience that friction too, in a way? There's a sort of like black British discourse. You said earlier, all of a sudden people are calling you French, so you're dealing with that projection. And translation, right? I mean, it sounds also a bit like Lost in translation in a way.
But I enjoyed that,
Yes.
actually. I enjoyed that, and because I was studying languages, so I was really comfortable with English, and I loved the language and learning songs and practicing it and using it. So I really integrated it in a way, in the body, in the mind, and I think I was very much part of that culture in a way, because I was 19 still. So from 10 years I lived there, and it was absorbed everything, So it was not like a form of mimetism, but it was, where one loses maybe a sense of themselves, but it was also there was a joy in kind of integrating the culture and accessing it, and so there was this difference, but at the same time, I could see a lot of similarities, and really kind of embrace the culture full on in a way that maybe is much more difficult as you get older, because then you're maybe not so readily available, and then there was also relationships. So everything conduced or induced towards like a kind of total absorption of the culture.
Do you remember the moment, which I would assume probably happened in the UK, when you were like, okay, I am an artist. I will be an artist. Or I already am. I'm in the process. And maybe it's also not. Sometimes we have this ideal image of, okay, this is the moment. But what were those crucial, processes? Maybe you can share with us.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, already at art school, I felt like we were taken seriously, and that felt like, irrelevantly of whether we will become artists, whatever that means in terms of professional career or whatever, people, the other artists we were talking to that were visiting us or advising us, they were talking to us seriously as if we were artists. So then there was not this sense of like doubt, and they made us feel very, very confident.
They addressed you already as this.
Yes, and seriously. So you're making this, so like stand for it.
Yes.
What is it? What is it about? Talk about it and present it. And so I think to be taken seriously so early at the stage where you might be unsure of what you're doing kind of helps a lot to kind of then for yourself to take it seriously in turn and be like, okay, what am I doing? What am I doing with this? Where do I want to go with this? And invest in it seriously. So I think maybe already from art school, but also that depends, on everyone. I can't talk for everyone in that sense, but for me,
but for you,
it was already then from art school, having kind of people interested and asking serious questions, leading towards things to read and things to listen or to pay attention to, and I felt.
And you are an artist, of course. I would say that the body plays a central role, maybe even the central role. But you not at all shy away from using many different media, be it film, photography. speech, maybe too, in a way, your body. Where did you take this freedom from to say, I will? Because that's something, and we will talk about it along the conversation. I like, at least that's the way I perceive your work. It's very free and it's very clear. You know, you're engaging very clearly with the quote unquote, you know, father or mother figures of art history, particularly in the French context, and very head on. You know, like you're not shying away from it, which is brave and very free. And I'm interested in how this came about. You know, how you.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, very free or maybe crazy.
They go all together. The three. But I think it requires at least some kind of, you know, inner freedom.
Yeah.
And it might be crazy too. But
I like this idea, but I think it took time for to feel that freedom. I think it was a sense of first, like paying homage to some artists whose practice I liked and were influential, but then also through digesting, looking, positioning myself in relation to them, interpreting their work, quoting them. I would not say necessarily always appropriating or reenacting, so words are very then specific then, but more in terms of like quotation and maybe sometimes even mimetism, trying to then see what is then going on in terms of my own body, then when I position my body and replace my body into their works, and or enter a conversation with their works. And because I think before I was writing mostly, like I said, about literature, and then I didn't really know how then to enter art or art history. And then with this very first film called Éducation Sentimentale, which is then referring to literature in the title, I'm looking at Bastian Adler and ask his friend who's with the curator and to pose as Bastian Adler, actually Bart van der Heide, and to pose as Bastian Adler falling from a tree where I catch him, or he's about to fall into the canal in Amsterdam, and I catch him before it falls into the canal. And so these two scenes were like trying, to look at the work of Bastian Adler from behind the camera, or from as if like a witness, but then also interrupting this kind of tragic, comedic kind of scenes with moments of tenderness, and thinking, okay, how would I like to see this work? What can I say about these works? And by making a comment on them being also in them, and commenting on art.
But I think that is like this beautiful, this free, this maybe also crazy, at times also grotesque. There's a lot of grotesque moments in your works. But it is an inscription. Like you say, hey, I'm just going to enter it. Like you said, I'm enter it, and sometimes very literally, physically.
Yeah.
And what does this do to you? If you say, like, I'm entering a space that's been so reserved and so written already.
Yeah. Well, first for me, there is this sense of sometimes also being this eternal, like amateur in a sense, and enjoying also. That's maybe when I get the freedom in the sense of there is no rule. Also thinking also maybe in art there is no rule, and that's why I enjoy like making art, because it's like, there seems to be a lot of rules, but maybe they're made also to be broken if we want to, make changes. And so learning Trio A from Yvonne Rainer, for example, was very much an emancipatory kind of act of, being a non-dancer, non-trained. And I remember very clearly in 2004, people saying like, how dare you dance?
I can imagine.
Yes. And they're like, you're not trained, but you're like learning this choreography. And it's like, well, it's a democratic dance. And even Rainer herself said that everybody can do it. So why can't I do it? And through this act of learning this choreography, really kind of understanding also her vision of like postmodern dance and how everything could become dance. So feeling much more empowered to create movements. And because we were saying, calling oneself an artist, calling oneself a dancer, calling oneself a writer. For me, it's more like how to then integrate these practices and like make them speak for like what my main aim is, to understand representation and its intricacies. And so whether it's the body, whether it's writing, whether it's photographing. And so so being this eternal amateur kind of means somehow that there isn't this it doesn't mean there isn't care and there is not attention and seriousness, but I think it just means that there is access, maybe, and there is maybe a certain sense of freedom that you were talking about, which I think is essential because I'm not working in an office, and therefore I need to find that liberty somehow, and that's maybe why I'm, doing this job.
But I was also wondering because, you do interact very explicitly with these names, Duchamp, for example, who's of course, particularly we're in France now, and it's the name. You call him also a father figure or like a
well, not
patriarch.
My father,
but if you talk about the conventional mainstream art, and particularly modern, canon, that's the moment. It's a caesura almost, and not almost, it is in art history. And you go there, you could also say, maybe I'm going to reference it, or I'm going to also ignore it. I don't want to deal with it. But you say I enter it, and how does it help your practice? Maybe help is the wrong word. How does it empower you to really say there's a direct confrontation?
I don't know. In the same way that maybe this appropriation artists were working, mostly female artists from the 80s. Sherry Levine, Louise Lawler. Elaine Sturtevant, maybe they might not call their practices all, and their practices might not fall under this label, and I don't want to speak for them in that sense, but I feel through a lack of representation and wanting to be in a picture, kind of seeing, okay, what is the mechanism? What is going on? What is art history doing? What is history doing? What do we remember? And to kind of play with that. It's not necessarily to kind of say, I have a desire to work with Duchamp because I love Duchamp's work and I'm a fan, or I understand his practice and I understand that he's well respected, but then it's like, how, in a way, would you pay more attention then and listen to what I say if then you recognize then Duchamp and say, oh yeah, now we know what you're doing because, there is this reference. And before it's like, what are you doing? There is a bit this sense of like, not justifying the practice, but kind of entering a language that I see is recognized, and that's a strategy saying, well, do you hear me now?
And it's also, you really make histories that have been so much suppressed or oppressed visible in a way. If I think about 2019 at Kunstwerke, Joan Noir, I think you had also previously performed it somewhere else.
No, that was the first time.
First time at Kunstwerke. And where, we're already talking about sort of like a minoritarian perspective, white gay man, particularly during the AIDS crisis, who've died, as we know. But then at the same time, we also know that a lot of queer people of color, women of color, men, black men, have died, and it's not been talked about, particularly also in the field of art history. And in this work, for example, you make that visible too. And I wonder if that's a strategy too, to say, I'm going to engage with these whatever dominant narratives. And just by being me and being there, we are really opening that prism and show,
Yeah, I think definitely. I think in this particular context, it was also about pointing out small gestures, the notion of touch, and how that saved maybe, well, it didn't save life, but it kind of revealed some form of humanity, which care, I think, and care, of course, and one in particular, I think, with women, lesbian women, were kind of providing care and touch to with dying gay men in the hospital beds, and when no one there touching them. And for me, that was such an extreme, beautiful gesture, and I was just kind of thinking how, like, sometimes we lose that humanity and we don't think of each other as a kind of, in terms of unity, as a community, and it's all these divisions, and it's like, okay, like, try to kind of think more intersectional, and then bring this thought into the work more and more. And so sometimes it might be like full on, head on, but it always takes time to try to kind of understand, okay, what makes us human rather than what kind of brings us separately, to brings us apart. And mostly with the current political context we're living, I think there's a lot of separation, and I think it's quite important to kind of think like what brings us together.
What do you think about touch, or also the visceral? The visceral reactions your work create, provoke. You also work with very clear objects and sort of like non-body or non-human forms. But what role is that sensual, sensory in your work?
So very often I think of it like this idea of getting in touch, because there is a play there. For me, it's time like getting in touch means like connecting, but then also through the act of touching, learning. So there is like recognizing, a bit like the child in the mirror stage, or like recognizing things as if blind, and touch allows you to kind of understand, the world better, what breaks, what is fragile, what is hard, what is soft. And then through this learning process, recognize things and understand the world that is around you, and understand yourself, your limits, your how, like, the skin also. I think, because for me the touch is always very linked to this idea of skin, and the skin is a receptory of touch and perceives a lot of things. So there is a lot there to unpack. But I read this really interesting article in the New Yorker once about the science of touch, and it says there's like one of the senses we know the least about, and it's mostly in terms of its absence, and we don't know what it is not to feel the touch. And when people lose, an arm, a hand, and how they try to recreate like this arm, and technically, and the most difficult is like to know how much pressure to exert on an object, and that's something that you learn, and that's really difficult for a computer, AI, etc., to recalculate, because it's something that you learn through experience. And also that relation of, okay, like egg, the word, the object, but then again, how to hold it without breaking it. How do you know that? So this article is really interesting also because there's an element also that they underline, which is that most of the researchers on the notion of touch are women. And so like that's
very gendered kind of.
Yeah, so there's something also very interesting there, I find, about this idea of getting in touch, connecting.
But I'm also now, when I think about your works, your installations, and the relationship between, let's say, objects in your practice, be it photographies or sculptures, made out of paper, in relation to your body, like how important is your body in relation to
the objects?
Does your body activate? Does it bring it somehow to life, or how do you describe that relationship?
I mean, this is an ongoing thing in research, let's say, or interest. I don't know if it's defined, but it's about specifically asking this question: how do I position myself in relation? I'm not an object. How do I position myself in relation to a picture that may represent me and it's not me? How do I represent also, how do I stand within a performance where I'm representing something, but again, it's not me, and to really kind of really maybe reanimate this question of like the subjects and, the difference between or subjectivity and point of view or perspective, positioning. These are more words that I would like to use in terms of that relation, image, text, body, because everything shifts constantly depending on where you are, who you're speaking to. And I'm interested in these different perspectives. And that's why I think a lot of images and works are sometimes recycled, visited, because it's like, I made this some years ago. What happens if I show it now? Differently, different display. Is it the same work 10 years on, 5 years on? the conversations are different, and is it, like we said, some of his, British artists from the 80s being now visible again, and I'm thinking of Claudette Johnson, and so, for example, and how their work is being put back into a context and reanimating conversations that were already happening back in the 80s, and so, but that's more art history now we're talking about. It's more like, okay, how do we revisit things and question, so I don't know, I'm very interested in that. Archival images, even found images that are made to look archival that actually are not, and questioning also this idea of maybe truth, or which again is very much of our times in terms of, what is real, what does it matter?
Yeah.
And
or grotesque, I
what do you mean by grotesque?
I have
actually?
yes, because because I keep having this image in my mind, and I haven't seen it. It was at the Chicago Architectural Biennial, Descendants de Nu performance where you wear this wooden piece made of it's a stair piece, and you have it on your head, but you're moving around, and it was to me so grotesque too. There's so much. Humor, it's funny, but it's also serious. It's deeply serious. It's referencing Duchamp, of course. But I was looking at it yesterday again, and I was really watching my own reaction, and I was like between just like laughing my head off and like it's so funny, but then also understanding, okay, there's something extremely serious about it too, but it happens simultaneously. So this is the complexity of your work, and that's why I asked earlier, like, what does your body, that is, and in this particular piece, of course, you see there's a body moving, particularly legs and arms, and then this super squarey head, which is so also grotesque on a certain level. And maybe you can talk about this piece again, because
so first,
very layered.
First, it's like I first performed it in Synagogue de Delm, which for me the context was really important, because I was like, okay, this is a synagogue, and we're coming as artists to make work in a place that still has an altar, and that has been designed in a very specific way. So I was thinking of this idea of the patriarchal figure because of that, and then positioning myself in relation. Then also I wanted to have as a counter, as a conversation with matriarchal figures also, who had worked with appropriation art. So then there was not only Duchamp, but it was Nancy Ottavant, Sherry Levin, Louise Lawler, and then I was like, where am I then in this? And then so the staircase, I was just, am I the staircase? Am I like, it's playful, yes, but then so there is a certain irony and playfulness, and I was just like, okay, if I'm the staircase, what do I perform, and where do I perform? So I'm performing right on the floor. And so initially I'm performing it, but at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, it's different performers. Did an audition, and we ended up hiring 5 different performers, who turned out to be all like female identified. And so it was interesting that I was shifting that performance. So I'm not performing it anymore. And the other anecdote about this headpiece is that you can't see anything when you're wearing it. So you don't know where you're going, and you don't. And that's quite a challenge, because you have to feel your way. So touch is then very important. There's a line on the floor which allows the performers to know where they are, because if you turn and move without vision, there's no way for you to know if you're facing the audience, if you're back, where you are. And when I first made it, I was like, what am I doing? But then I went on.
So orientation.
Yes, there was no sense of orientation. And I was just like, also to know which movements you are making if you're not seeing them. Because images are very central also to dance, the mirror, what you're doing, which image you're creating. So if you're not seeing it, how can you know? So then there's this big division suddenly in terms of what you're experiencing as a performer, what you're seeing as an audience. There's this sensory cut somehow. And so it's very much
perception,
about...
like there's no
perception. And so it's very much about feeling that head, which is then, soft material, and sometimes banging the head, and then also feeling your way through. And then, so there is something really funny about it, but also, and I guess maybe that's this kind of more like Bastien Adler-ish influence of this tragi-comic thing of like some things are totally like romantic sometimes, but then also tragic and funny, and so that's like the circle of life. It's just like for me, it's totally normal to integrate that in the practices, and like because that's what we're experiencing anyway. So so the piece has then been performed by different performers
in Chicago. That was
yes, and then also since I think it has been acquired by the Modern Musette, and then we've made a protocol, and then so it can be performed by different people, so it's not essentially me. But there is also the question, okay, when is it essential that it's me performing something? Why not? And with Figure the Still, that is quoting Yoko Ono's cut piece. It was then important that I was performing it as this person of color. And
which you recently performed too, again in Düsseldorf.
Yeah, in November. Last November. So it was interesting then to we had this discussion with the curator how important it is that it is my body then performing this work and not me, asking somebody else to perform it, which is a question, because like what's the future of that performance when I'm not there? Who's gonna be? How are we gonna, have it again or play it again? I was about to say play it again. Rewind. No, but like how is it kind of supposed to be?
And how are you dealing with this question? And it's a question that for every performance artist is of course important, that works in such a medium that's so ephemeral and focused on the moment. And if you like you said, if museums want to acquire it, with certain instructions or scores or something, how do you make decisions like that? Do you require certain bodies? Do you make even these classifications?
Yeah, I'm really thinking about it also as something like inclusive and trying to say, okay, so maybe do whoever wants to perform it can potentially perform it, but they have to be aware of what it kind of forces me to ask myself, where is the work? Is the work, what is the work? There's the person performing it, like the context they're performing in, the objects they're performing with, so it's
do you want to define it so intensely, or do you leave space for opening?
I think there is space for opening and to kind of for new people to give new definitions to the work, to redefine it, and I think that's important. And
it's important to you too when you think about institutions acquiring it.
Yes, and also when I think of like contexts and like things, perspective changing all the time. So I don't, in 10 years' time we'll have maybe a different conversation about representation, and maybe it's good if it's a different body that performs it. So to leave space for that, I think is important.
The openness. I'm just, because when we talk about body and body politics, body images, I was also just thinking, and you've been talking about it too a lot, the show Frammenti you did in Thomas Dane in Napoli, in Naples, southern Italy, where you literally, almost like an archaeologist, look at antique sculptures and debunk this idea that they have been, classically white, and also in a way uphold this very brutal history of whiteness, but they actually were very varied and had, all sorts of colors. And with that work, of course, you deeply critique our current body images still, the body politic. Maybe you explain a bit what you found and how it also influenced your thinking about body.
So I found within Napoli Archaeological Museum some sculptures that are actually of color, black, or sometimes there is color. The lips are red, the nails are painted, or the nipples, and there's this known sculpture that I had on my phone for years. I didn't even know where it was.
Just as an image.
As an image, and it was called like the Barbarian, and it was like depicting a man in marble, but the marble was black, and it was the first time that I was seeing black marble used to depict a person, and I was like, oh, and this happened to be called the Barbarian, so I was just like, okay, what is this? And it's only actually visiting the museum in Napoli, preparing the exhibition, but I had already this in mind, that I saw this, and I was like, oh my god, this is like serendipity, like it's amazing that this work is there in this city where I'm doing this exhibition and thinking about this idea of color within classical sculpture. And then then it was then about bringing the idea of a live body in connection to the static bodies and this idea then of color and animating in the sense of like putting the image always on this tension, this risking the image as an object and not being so precious about it, turning it into an object, and then again asking ourselves like, how do we position ourselves in relation to this object? Where do we stand? Where do we stand in relation to this physically, intellectually? And so, and also looking at Pompeii and these ruins of bodies, because I've heard that maybe most of the wealthiest people had left before. And so who were left, maybe the servants or the slaves at the time. And so there's representation of these bodies that were not considered of value somehow that now are in a museum and they're like made of dust. So this various kind of sense of values through representation and what is left of bodies that didn't have a value, or considered not valuable and left behind, are now in the museum was also very interesting.
I'm interested in how you, in these moments as a performer, you just said that you were like interacting, you know, how do you feel in these moments? Like what do you feel? Do
in
you
the live
pay
moment?
Do you pay, I mean, can you even pay attention to it? I mean, oftentimes as a performer, of course, you're like somewhere else and don't have necessarily all this, the ability to sense, but with projects like this, when you kind of interact with this very, you know, long, deep history, like how do you feel?
You know, in the act of performing,
in the act,
or
in
like,
the act, and but maybe also, of course, in the preparation. But I'm really interested in how you feel when you like live interact, for example.
I think this takes time. It's not necessarily in the act of performing, necessarily in the moment. Maybe after, with distance, with time, and I think that's what also I get to the next work, and I'm like, okay, I have time to digest and distance myself to the last performance and see, okay, what works, what doesn't work. While performing, of course, there's this sense of maybe I feel stronger in the sense of like I am behind the work and the work is supporting me and we are in this conversation and the collaborations and with the various performers I work with, and I think it's really something that comes then with time and distance to the work to understand, okay, what is it actually doing? Is it doing what I wanted it to do? Is it doing something else? Giving you also that space for it to exist and be like, oh, okay. You know, because if we're talking about Descendants du Nu, which is from, 2016, for example, and I feel that somehow it kind of gathered visibility, maybe more recently than when it was actually made.
Yeah.
So, and therefore, kind of, what happened, in that time.
But there is, at least in this moment for you, in that presence you have, there is a sense of empowerment.
I was hesitating to use the word, and I was like, "Is it there or not?" There is,
and it's not lasting, maybe, but there is. It's momentary.
Yeah,
it's a momentary.
I mean, it's also attention, right? People are paying attention to a work, mostly if it's live. That there's this momentum where you're gathering a form of attention or respect or kind of and not. Being dismissed or you're being listened to also. So there is a form of empowerment to kind of say
it's ephemeral. It's not necessarily like
come and listen, come and watch, and come and think with me, in this moment. And then, as you say, it's ephemeral, but at least it has happened. And there is a great satisfaction to take in this, in the sense of however ephemeral it is, to kind of be able to make that little journey together and to be to create that temporary community, or even in terms of the audience, and
So is that for you a little bit like the blessing and the curse at the same time of performance? I mean, it's a topic that I think.
Yeah, I mean, performance creates a lot of anxieties. So there's many blessing and
Talk about that
curses.
too. Yes, please.
Because I'm like, do I still need to perform? Can I get some other people to perform now? You know, there were really moments where I was like, why am I doing this to myself? You know, I was really like, this is excruciating.
I mean,
And
just
so-
the fact to present your body, which is this most medium in a way, you know.
Yeah,
where you
it's
have
very-
to carry around, walk with.
Yeah, exactly, and it's very, but it's really revealing. I think
Yeah.
somehow, and it puts you in a vulnerable position. And it's not always that we want to repeat that, you know, because sometimes it can also, I feel, can also work against you. You know, there was a situation when I performed in an art fair. I did a performance repeatedly where I'm taking my shirt off and I'm having a film projected on my back. It's called Object/My Affection, which I just showed at Participant Inc. with a different performer. But it's a work from like almost 20 years old, maybe less, 15 or so. And then I was like, yeah, and I want to work around objectification, and you know, in an art fair, it's great, you know, it's like commodification, blah blah. And then I was like, oh my god, this is like I'm being completely commodified. And I was like having this like, you know, curators coming to see the work. And then I was like, you're not looking at the work. You know, there was this like, I'm like kind of, am I kicking myself in the foot there, but trying to comment on something, but then just repeating, you know, like, what am I actually doing? And so there was this many moments where...
But your physicals, I mean, you sensed immediately that this is a complete commodification of...
yeah.
And also in a way that you felt that your work doesn't actually work there in this, or like, is it...
I don't know, but it was interesting to actually experience it, to be doing something on a daily basis in an art fair, and as a performance, as an artist, in a moment that is extremely, you know, commercial.
Extremely, yeah.
And then be like, because it was like, okay, I want to comment on that, you know, it's the impossibility of that. But then as an act, as a performance, it was difficult and it was hard, and it was like, what is it doing? You know, and still to this day, I'm asking myself, and showed this performance, you know, after many years again, now a participant, it had then a totally different meaning and
power
feel,
too,
and also in relation to the works of Teresa Hakyum-Sha, who has made a lot of performances using our body. So I think it entered a conversation that was really different and much closer to what I wanted to do. But it was great to have the time and the space to do that and see that happening.
But I guess the reverse question would be, could you even see your practice without your body, without your live body, I mean?
Oh yes, I mean, yeah, I mean images. I'm very interested in making images, constructing, making sculptures. So for me, there are bodies, different bodies. The images are and the sculptures are different bodies.
But isn't your body at some point, all like with body I mean now really like your physical presence, at some point the necessary element in your cosmos, artistic cosmos, or maybe?
Yes, it is. But I'm also seeing, you know, the fact that, you know, this body's not going to be there forever. So then what? Then how then, you know, to continue practicing, because I'm also not able to move like the way I was moving before. I'm just realizing. Turning 50, like, ow.
This year, by the way.
Yes. I was like, ow, this hurts. I can't do this anymore. And so there is a sense, okay, you work with somebody else, but that is part of it as well.
Yes.
So we are not there forever. Like the work might not be there forever. So this vulnerability or this fragility is integrated in whichever representation I'm trying to make, in the sense of this impermanence, you know, and so, yeah, you know, like this grotesque thing we were talking about, and this tragicomic thing, is also that, like how we're kind of, the futilities, you know, we are kind of avoiding, well, you used to avoid, it's, you know, fatality or reality that we are not permanent.
Permanent,
No.
yeah. Maybe to close now and to go back to the beginning, that you are here now and you said at least for the next 1.5 years. How will all this, and I think it's important to talk about the impermanence of the body, and that we of course leave at a certain point. How is this influencing you right now, particularly in your time being back in Paris, in this place that shaped you so much as a child? And
Totally.
how? Talk about it.
I
What
don't
is it?
know.
Tell us.
I don't know. I
Everything.
don't know. For example, so now I'm doing this, Art Explorer residency. That's where we are here right now. I've applied with a project that's dealing with police violence, for example,
In France.
in
the
France
context of France.
specifically, and which is something that also touches me personally.
Yes.
My father was a policeman for 30 years of his life. My mom a nurse, and I feel there's like also this thing about migrants from the Caribbean who came to France and worked mostly in the service industry and for the state. And because they could go back to the Caribbean every 2 years for free, so there was this attraction for these workers to come to Paris and do these jobs. And so I find myself reflecting on this idea of care and violence very, very personally, and also with what's happening in France in terms of police, which I think is frankly a bit frightening, or questionable. And thinking, yes, what are these? How to position these black bodies, whether they're in front of the police or in the police. For me,
Also,
it's also not looking at just one perspective, and so what is then happening, and what so again, this notion of vulnerability, this notion of do I have enough distance now, having lived the way, to come back and look at this? And for me, it's very often when I do things, and I do ask myself, am I allowed to do this? Can I do this? It's a whole set of questions.
For sure.
And that kind of leads me into it in a sense of, why not? Why can't I say anything about this? Is that a problem? Is that a problem? Then it's interesting.
So it's a mental process you definitely go through.
Yeah, and also in terms of how is this going to create a work? Is this, can I work? Can I make work about this? And it's like a philosophical question, and that might not be answered in the work, but that kind of leads me or drives me, because I'm like, okay, there's something to think about here, and something to position oneself in relation to. Yeah.
I think you have a lot to say, and I also think that Paris and France are lucky to have you back for a while, at least, for sure. For sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Merci. Dankeschön.